Hello, welcome to part 12 of toxins sequestration theory. This is my new theory of cancer. I'm very excited about it because it gives a completely new take on cancer relative to the mainstream. The mainstream believes that cancer is a genetic disease that's selfish and malignant. I'm arguing that's not the case. Cancer is not a genetic disease. In fact, cancer tumors are not even selfish. They're actually unselfish team players where the body creates cancer tumors in order to sequester and store and process toxins. In other words, cancer tumors are the body's defense against toxic overload, and they act as a detox organ, or in other words, they act as a second liver because the liver is the primary detox organ. So yeah, this is a new theory. I'm not the first person who came up with it, but I am sort of the person who extended it to many different toxins. It was discovered by Stephanie Seneff, who's an MIT professor for the case of deuterium, and I extended it to many other toxins. And I believe other people have come up with this theory before as well. Um, but now, finally, we're really starting to understand exactly how this works at the biochemical level. So that's where it gets really exciting. And we're starting to get the bird's eye view for all the different toxins that cancer cells sequester and store and process. There's the traditional toxins from the 1900s, like drinking alcohol and cigarette smoke. Cancer cells, process those. And then there's the new toxins, the modern toxins like microplastics, for example. There's the dietary toxins like, glucose, fructose, seed oils, and as well as some of the toxic metals, the heavy metals, excess iron, and as well as the plant toxins, oxalates, and deuterium. So there's a very long list of toxins, and I've covered them in previous videos. And what I want to talk about today, I'm very excited about extending my theory to brain cancer. So that's going to be the topic of today's video. Previously, I talked about how cancer tends to form preferentially in specific organs and not others. And that's really interesting because the mainstream theory can't really explain that. From the mainstream perspective, cancer is random, right? Basically, you get random genetic mutations in different organs, and so you would expect cancer to just randomly appear in every single organ. But that's not what we see experimentally. In practice, what we see in the clinical setting, right, is that cancer occurs a lot in the prostate, occurs a lot in the breast, occurs a lot in the lungs, occurs a lot in the skin. There's certain organs in particular where cancer shows up the most, and it does not occur much, by the way, in the heart or the spleen. And I've talked about reasons for that. Basically, the body does not want to build a cancer tumor in a spot where it would threaten survival. And if you did build a heart tumor, it could threaten survival. And similarly for the spleen's job is to fight infections. And so if you build a tumor in the spleen, then you could impair your body's ability to fight infections there. But on the other hand, things like the prostate, it's a great organ to build a tumor in because it's not the most vital organ. And similarly, it has really good sequestration abilities. It's really good at pulling in fat-soluble toxins, things like seed oils that are obviously toxic. Prostates are really good at storing those. So now, but one of the questions people gave me when I came up with this tissue-specific version of my theory was, why is it that brain cancer does occur? After all, the brain is a very vital organ, and you would think the body would try to avoid building a tumor in the brain. The brain's so important. Why would the body want to build a tumor up there? And of course, it's worth noting that brain cancer is not the most common cancer. The most common cancer is skin cancer. And I've argued that that's because skin is the most peripheral tissue. It's the farthest away from your internal organs. So it's the best place to put a tumor, would be the skin. And it's the body's first line defense against toxicity because it's kind of like the barrier between your body and the rest of the world. So skin's a great place from a perspective of keeping things away from the vital organs. But the brain, on the other hand, doesn't seem very logical to build a tumor in. But like I said, it's not the most common cancer. Skin cancer, lung cancer, and prostate and breast, those are more common than brain cancer. But nevertheless, it does happen. Brain cancer does happen, of course. And so let's try to understand why that happens. Like, why would it be that cancer never forms in the heart, but it does sometimes form in the brain? And the argument is kind of simple. Basically, the body has no other choice. Sometimes what happens is that toxins do cross the blood-brain barrier. And what makes the brain different from other organs is that the brain is heavily fortified. It's like has a fortress, a wall that protects it from the rest of the body. And no other organ has really that, key property, where it's like truly basically isolated from the blood. That's called the blood-brain barrier. It has a wall protecting it. And the blood-brain barrier specifically walls off the brain from toxins. That's its job. It has to protect the body, protect the brain from toxic exposure. And so the brain is basically designed to be an isolated structure. It's meant to be isolated from toxins. That's not true for the heart, by the way. And it's not necessarily true for other organs as well. So that's what makes the brain unique. But nevertheless, still, some toxins can cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain, and especially as you expose yourself to more and more toxins, you might eventually damage the blood-brain barrier, and then more toxins can get in. So, and the brain does not have storage capacity like other organs do. Organs like the liver can actually build fat around it. That's what's called fatty liver disease. You guys have heard of fatty liver disease? Well, fatty liver means that the liver decided to build fat around it in order to store toxins. And the brain can't do that because the skull has limited size. And so the brain can't just say, oh, let me just build like a layer of fat around my brain. It can't really do that because there's no space for it. There's just no space in the skull for like extra fat. The liver can also grow in size, by the way, but the brain can't really do that either. Whereas, also in the heart has a strategy where it's right next to other organs. It's right next to the liver. So it can say like, hey, liver, go take these toxins for me, right? It can basically rely on its neighbors to push toxins away from the heart. So the heart has other options. It can say, well, I'm going to send these toxins over to the liver and to these other organs that are close by. But the brain doesn't really have any neighbors, right? It doesn't have any close by neighbors to push toxins over to. And also, like I said, the heart can also build some fat around it. The heart does have the ability to put some fat around to store some toxins, but the brain can't. So it doesn't have other options. The heart has other options. The brain does not. And so that means that it's basically binary. And like there's, you either have one or two choices. You either allow the toxins that have crossed the blood-brain barrier to cause neuronal damage, which is what they will do. They will damage the nerve cells. You can allow that. You can allow them to be neurodegenerative, or you build a brain tumor, right? Those are the only two options. Like either you allow neurodegeneration or you build a brain tumor. And that's the dilemma that the brain faces that other organs don't necessarily face such a harsh dilemma. And so that's basically the argument for why brain tumors happen. It's a last resort strategy to protect the brain from neurodegeneration. And so, okay, so hopefully that's kind of sets the stage for why brain cancer does occur, whereas heart cancer doesn't, because the heart has other options, whereas the brain doesn't. And all right, so let's talk a little bit about the blood-brain barrier. Like I said, that is the body's first line defense to protect the brain against these toxins. And the blood-brain barrier, the BBB, its job is to be a highly selective shield. So it's supposed to allow nutrients to cross, and of course oxygen. So it's supposed to allow nutrients and oxygen to cross, but then be a shield against toxins like microplastics, heavy metals, and other things. And Yeah, so and as well as pathogens, of course, as well. So things like bacteria, viruses, those kind of things. And in a healthy person, the BBB is very effective, and that's why brain cancers are more rare, of course, than liver cancers or colon cancers. Um, but nevertheless, in today's modern toxic world, where we're sort of persistently exposed to many toxins, like I said, things like microplastics, seed oils, heavy metals, they can gradually weaken or sneak past the barrier. Uh, and yeah, so basically, there's also these epithelial cells, sorry, no, endothelial cells that are lining the blood vessels at the blood-brain barrier. And if you get damage to those endothelial cells, then that can damage your blood-brain barrier. And there's many ways to do that. You can imagine that if you have diabetes, then the high blood sugar could damage those endothelial cells and weaken your blood-brain barrier as well. So yeah, and like I said, this the brain has like no safe storage capacity, and that's what makes it unique. So the liver can enlarge itself, build fat storage around it. Fat tissue can always grow, so you can always grow the fat in your belly, but the brain is a rigid structure that's not expandable, and so that's why the tumor growth is really the only option. With that said, it's not without cost. Like when a tumor does grow inside the brain, it takes up volume, right? It takes up some volume. So that in that sense, the tumor is meant to be very dense. It's not meant to be like huge or something, because it does displace healthy normal neurons, right? So it doesn't come without a cost. So the body has to. It really is a kind of last resort situation. Um, the first resort is the blood-brain barrier itself, right? The BBB is the first resort. The tumor is after things manage to sneak across somehow the blood-brain barrier. So let's talk about some of the toxins that could get into the brain. Uh, these include, first and foremost, the toxic metals. So all the heavy metals, and I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that heavy metals do mess with the brain. It's well known that in children exposed to heavy metals, it causes all sorts of learning disabilities, lead exposure, cadmium, mercury, etc., arsenic. All these things mess with the brain. And then on top of that, there's iron and copper. So free iron and free copper act as toxins and create ROS, reactive oxygen species, as well. So all those metals can potentially, cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain and cause all sorts of problems. So other ones include microplastics. And believe it or not, microplastics and nanoplastics are dramatically elevated in brain tissue overall. It's kind of scary there that those things actually get into the brain. And seed oils. So seed oil, and both the sort of unoxidized and the oxidized versions of seed oils, they get into the brain as well. Drinking alcohol, so like any chemical, right, that when you drink it, then it gives you a buzz, then of course that can get into the brain. So obviously ethanol, drinking alcohol can get into the brain. Mold toxins, these mycotoxins as well, can get into the brain. Pesticides and agricultural chemicals. So there's a strong occupational link where things like firefighters, farmers, industrial workers show increased risk of brain cancer. And it's just largely due to these chemicals that they're exposed to on the job. And then finally, there's these forever chemicals. I'll talk about them another time. But it turns out that the PFAS, these forever chemicals, which are found in things like nonstick pans, they are also elevated. They also get into the brain as well and can lead to brain cancer. So, okay, then so then let's talk about how how the brain tumors actually sequester these toxins. And they do have actual transporters that they put on their surface. Um, these so there's things called uh, anion transporters, and these things help to shuttle like protein bound toxins, things like pesticides bound to proteins, metals bound to proteins, and the cancers will uptake those things. For example, like the iron and the copper, and pull those things in, and similarly with the lipid toxins, they end up what they do is that they actually store these lipid toxins in lipid droplets. So the oxidized seed oils, as well as the microplastics and the forever chemicals, get as well as like other fat soluble toxins. They actually get shoved into lipid droplets, and this is actually one of the most fascinating things about the brain cancers is that they have tons of lipid droplets just floating around inside of them. And that's different than standard normal brain tissue. Normal brain tissue does not have any lipid droplets at all. But brain cancer cells are full of these lipid droplets. Imagine these little balls of lipids just floating around inside of these brain cancer cells. And those lipid droplets contain seed oils, they contain microplastics, they contain forever chemicals, as well as other fat soluble toxins. And they're literally just there for safekeeping. Like the cancer cell is not actually using them for a purpose. And so that, of course, further supports my theory that cancer cells are just toxin storage vaults. Why, in any other theory, would cancer cells just have these lipid droplets floating around? So, but like I said, they're not present in normal neurons. Normal neurons do not have lipid droplets floating around. So this is one of the most striking things, and it's present in glioblastoma, which is a brain cancer, and yeah, it's one of the most striking features of glioblastoma is that they are packed with lipid droplets, and of course that raises concerns about people who may have brain cancer may be getting exposed to too many of these fat soluble toxins. Obviously, the seed oils comes to mind first, but also the forever chemicals and the microplastics. Just got to watch out for those things. But also, it gives a kind of toxin to organ mapping, right? Because, if you do have these, if you do have a brain tumor, right, and you're worried like, oh, how did I get this brain tumor? Well, some of the first things you should think about are things like seed oils, right? Think about the toxic metals. Think about the heavy metals, the excess iron, the excess copper, and you should be thinking also about the microplastics and the forever chemicals, and try to cut those out because those are the things that are directly linked to brain cancer. And like I said, it's interesting that different toxins are linked to cancers in different tissues. I already talked about how with the breast, it's connected to excess estrogen, and as well as oxalates and seed oils. And with the liver, it's connected to excess iron, excess fructose, excess ethanol, drinking alcohol. So each organ has its own toxins that contribute to cancer in that organ. And so I find that toxin organ mapping kind of fascinating there. So, all right. And then there is evidence, of course, to support this viewpoint. Like I said, there's been recent analysis where they've analyzed brain tumor samples and found that there's tons of, say, microplastics inside of brain tumors, right? So like they actually literally look at brain tumors and found microplastics and nanoplastics inside of brain tumors. Similarly, they found tons of these forever chemicals, these PFAS, inside of brain tumor tissue, much higher concentrations of forever chemicals inside of brain tumor tissue than in normal brain tissue. So, and then the same thing is true with the toxic metals. So, glioblastomas, which are brain cancers, are iron overloaded. They're full of iron. They're full of this free iron, and it's like little balls of iron. It's not iron actually participating in biology. It's literally like balls of iron metal stored inside of these glioblastomas. And similarly, it's been shown the same thing is true for the other toxic metals, things like free copper, cadmium, lead, and mercury. All of those have been shown to be elevated inside of brain tumor tissue relative to normal brain tissue, okay? And then I already talked about how the lipid droplets are present in the glioblastomas, but not in the normal brain tissue. So okay, so that's some of the evidence supporting this viewpoint. And if you want practical advice, right? And of course, I'm not handing out medical advice to people, but just from a logical perspective, right? If those are the toxins that cause brain cancer, then obviously you would want to say use a high quality water filter to reduce your microplastics, your forever chemicals, and your toxic metals, your heavy metals and things like that. That's the first thing, is get a good water filter. Second thing is limit your exposure to alcohol, ethanol, right? Because that crosses the blood-brain barrier. Limit your exposure to mold and mycotoxins, because the mycotoxins also cross the blood-brain barrier as well. Absolutely avoid seed oils. Like, get the seed oils out of your diet. Those seed oils get stored inside of these brain cancer cells. So, and then the other thing that you can do is strengthen the blood-brain barrier, and also strengthen your peripheral detox organs. So, how do you strengthen your blood-brain barrier? Well, naturally, the first thing you want to do is make sure you're not damaging it chronically. So you want to make sure that there aren't chronic toxins always in the bloodstream, things like high blood sugar, right? So if you have high blood sugar, that could potentially damage the endothelial cells that are involved in the blood-brain barrier. But then also just simply prioritizing deep sleep and stress reduction, that helps to maintain the BBB integrity. Following a sort of meat-based carnivore-style diet provides you with the animal fats and the proteins needed to nourish, the blood-brain barrier, and also obviously eliminates the seed oils that could cause the damage there. And of course, we're also trying to nourish our primary detox organs, the liver and the kidneys. So we want to make sure eating a animal-based diet helps to nourish those organs as well. And then minimizing iron overload, because like I said, the excess free iron does generate oxidative stress that directly damages the blood-brain barrier. And you do that, by the way, by cutting out, don't take iron supplements, never take iron supplements, by the way, because those have free iron. Obviously avoid the fortified foods that have iron added to them, like the breakfast cereals. And then, of course, even things like spinach and vegetables have naturally occurring non-heme iron. The heme iron that's in red meat is perfectly fine, because that's the non-toxic form of iron. It's the non-heme iron that's in the plant-based foods that's the real problem. Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up, I think brain cancer fits in quite well into this toxin sequestration theory, my tissue-specific version of it. The brain is basically the last resort to protect the brain tissue from toxic overload. And as you can imagine, the first resort is the blood-brain barrier. That's meant to keep out the toxins. But nevertheless, there are some toxins that do manage to get across that barrier. And the job of a brain tumor is to sequester whatever gets across that blood-brain barrier. Not every toxin can get across, which means that there's only a subset of toxins that brain tumors are meant to sequester and store. It's whatever gets across the blood-brain barrier. Now, of course, once you have damage to the BBB, then more toxins can get across. And so a damaged BBB is bad news, because then that necessitates more need for a brain tumor. And so, if I did have a brain tumor, the first thing I would ask myself is, do I have a damaged blood-brain barrier, right? That's what I would ask myself, and I would try to fix that somehow with, like very healthy, careful diet that eliminates toxins, of course, in the first place. Um, but I think there is hope. If you do have a brain tumor, or if you're worried about, brain tumors, I gave a list of toxins that contribute to brain tumors, right? Things like the toxic metals, the forever chemicals, the seed oils, the microplastics, and those are some of the things you can focus on, right? Um, all right, so thanks very much for listening. Let me know your thoughts, and I'm very excited about this sort of deeper understanding of brain cancer. Thanks.